So thanks, Rumi. So hey, everyone, I'm Julia. I use she, her pronouns. I'm an MBA 2023 candidate here at London Business School. I promise it's nothing personal. I don't smell. That's not why the other panelists aren't up here with me. They didn't hear that I was moderating and cancel their flights to London. But they are Maeve and Kate and Pips, just the most fantastic group. I'm a little biased, but I think the most fantastic group you might hear from this weekend. So I'm actually going to turn it over to them to introduce themselves. So Pips, why don't we start with you?
Thank you so much, very much, Julia. I appreciate that, and lovely to see you. And definitely not, I would have loved to have been there in person with you. So my name is Max Pips Bunce, pronouns she, her, they. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today, and what an amazing conference, right? What an amazing group, and attendees, you are all so fab. So thank you very much, and we've got the best moderator here ever. You're superstars, all of you. I'm a director here at Credit Suisse, also head of our investment banking technology, strategic programs, large financial services company, 65,000 employees, and I'm incredibly proud of the work that we do on LGBTQI inclusion, definitely. More so, I'm really proud to be also our co-chair of our EMEA LGBT and Ally program at CS. We've got over 6,000 active and engaged allies here at work, really driving so much cultural change. So again, proud of each and every one of them. At the personal level, so I'm gender fluid and non-binary, so definitely part of the trans spectrum. I do a lot of work, speaking in Parliament, Government Equalities Office, and then with a lot of external firms. And I'm just so honoured to be here on the panel with you amazing people and be part of this conference today, because honestly, all of this stuff means so much to me. So it's a pleasure and an honour to be here. Looking forward to the session. Thank you so much. Over back to you, Julia.
Thanks, Pips. Kate, why don't we go to you next for introductions, and then Maeve, over to you.
Of course. So tough act to follow there with Pips, but no, everyone, my name is Kate Kraske. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm coming to you today from New York. Prior to joining Columbia Business School, I spent 3.5 years at Goldman Sachs in a team called Regulatory Policy, which is where Julia and I actually got to first know each other. I would say a lot of my experience has been centered around my time at Goldman Sachs, in particular, as the first person to transition openly while at the firm. It's been highly informative. Julia and I actually use that time, as we'll speak about later, to make some really, really amazing changes within the landscape, not just of the firm, but hopefully, more broadly across the entire financial industry. Today, I'm a second year at Columbia Business School, heading into investment banking. And I also spent a lot of my time here at Columbia doing anti-racism work, particularly for Columbia's Race, Diversity, and Inclusion Task Force.
Amazing. Thanks, Kate. And Maeve, introductions, please.
Thanks, Julia. I'm very excited to be here. I'm Maeve DuValle. I'm a managing director in corporate communications at Goldman Sachs. Been at Goldman Sachs for about 18 years. This is just a great panel. I'm just really excited to meet Pips for the first time. Pips is just a giant in the corporate transgender world, and be reunited with my former Goldman Sachs colleagues, Julia and Kate. My pronouns are she and her. I'm very active in our internal affinity network, LGBTQ+ affinity network at Goldman Sachs. And I also mentor a lot of transgender people who are in various stages of coming out in corporate America. So look forward to a great panel. I'm here despite the fact that I'm on the West Coast of the US, which means it's rather early in the morning, but I'm ready and raring to go.
You are, and looking fabulous, might I add. And special shout out, Maeve, you did get up exceptionally early, and we truly appreciate it. So jumping right in, I think in the LGBTQ+ community, there's certainly, and Ingo alluded to this earlier, a lot of terminology, a lot of vocabulary. But I think for us to have a really good, honest dialogue, we need to start off with some, terminology, just so we're all kind of speaking the same language and level setting. So to that, Maeve, can you just help us understand, the difference between sex assigned at birth, and gender or gender identity?
Sure. sex generally refers to the physical differences between males and females. That could be your chromosomes, it could be your genitalia, and it's generally non-binary. There is intersex, which people who have characteristics of both male and female, but generally it's binary. Gender refers to how people identify, and there is a whole spectrum of terms that you've probably heard, and places where people identify along that spectrum. You know, there are male and female, there are non-binary, and then there's gender non-conforming. Those are the four big categories, but within those categories, there are many, many, many more parts of the spectrum that people identify with. So it's very, very different.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess building off of that, Kate, can you kind of help us understand more, about gender identity? So, what's the difference between perhaps someone who identifies as transgender within the gender binary versus someone who identifies as gender nonconforming, or someone who identifies as non-binary? What are the key differences there for folks to understand?
Sure. So one thing I would say before I even get started, right, is the fact that anything I say right now could in theory be outdated in a number of months, let alone years, right? This space is evolving rapidly when we think about the lexicon around gender and identity, right? And so that is something that makes it very challenging, particularly if you're trying to get up the curve. But it's also what makes this space so exciting, right? Is the fact that people are finding new words and terms to describe their lived experience, right? So I would just start from there. When we talk about, right, transgender, as Maeve so aptly put, right, that's where sex assigned at birth might not necessarily align with the societal norms, your actions may not align per se with society's expectations of sex assigned at birth. Another term you're going to hear throughout this is TGNC, that's trans and gender nonconforming. That is just one of those umbrella terms that recognizes the fact that the word transgender might not be as inclusive as we want it to be, and we want to make sure every single person in our community is included under the umbrella. As far as it comes to the binary, right? You've got this sort of masculine and feminine binary that people have held historically. So for instance, right, I identify within that binary, right? I am very squarely on the feminine side of that binary. However, if we think about gender as a spectrum, right? You've got sort of these two polar ends of the spectrum, right? The masculine and the feminine maybe. And that's where all of these the shades of gray, right, is where all these other terms come in, whether you've got non-binary, gender non-conforming, and so many other terms, right? One thing I would say is that a lot of these terms are highly personal in nature, right? Because of the way they've come into being, they are personal, they mean slightly different things to different people. So when in doubt, excuse me, broadly, I would say feel free to ask someone, assuming the context is correct, what they prefer. You might have someone who says, I prefer to be identified as gender queer, but not non-binary, right? Because of those lived experiences, right? You might find divergences and say, I don't necessarily see or perceive the difference in these two experiences for these folks. But I'm just going to go ahead and trust their experience, right? And take their lead.
And it's such a good pivot into our next question for Pips about trusting in others' lived experience, and specifically being proactive in how we want to show respect to others and the ways that we want to be referred to, and that how we move through the world, we want others to treat us with respect, but that does require engagement from the other people we interact with. So Pips, to that point, pronouns, I think in the last couple of years, a lot of folks certainly we've been talking about this more in the workplace. We have pronouns on our name badges here at the conference. Can you kind of help us understand, why are we having this conversation a bit more? What are some of the different types of pronoun sets? There are a lot of different pronoun sets. Not everyone uses the same ones. And specifically, like, how does proactive pronoun sharing facilitate more inclusive spaces, for the TGNC and the non-binary community?
Thank you. That is such a good question, and it warms my heart so much to see this conversation happening. And if I had emotions on this Zoom, I'd send everyone a big hug because it's so good hearing that. I think pronouns, before we talk about exactly what they are, I think you touched on it there. And it's also more about what they represent. They are such an important thing for so many different reasons. For me, someone that's non-binary, gender fluid, I don't know how I'm going to express until I wake on a given day, right? Some days I might be more one end of the spectrum, other days others. So, even more so for me, other people can find my pronouns confusing, but that's the important thing. It's so personal to everyone. I think as a human being, it's really important and powerful as to what they represent, to have your gender identity and to have your identity validated and affirmed. That's a big thing, because I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone, right? When you get misgendered, when someone's misgendering you, whether it's just a subtle mistake or being done to cause intent or harm, it's a hurtful thing. So getting pronouns right and people taking the time to do so means so very much. So it's really important. And yes, mistakes happen, but when it's not being done to cause upset, mistake, apologize, move on, it's absolutely fine. But it's always best to ask and get it right rather than assume and quite often get it wrong, because respecting this stuff makes people feel safe. And I think, pronouns to what they are, in relation to gender identity, they are purely nouns that refer to some other individual in place of their name, but in the third person. So I think a few points on that. One thing to call out, there are lots of different options, right? And there is no right or there is no wrong. Very personal thing, and personally what's going to fit best for you. And I think, as we heard earlier, it's a constantly evolving landscape, right? Because as more identities become understood, people get more open and accepting about being their authentic self, it's going to continue changing, which is a good thing in itself. I think in terms of, there is lots of different options. Yes, there are more common ones that people are probably more, used to. There's the she, her, he, him, they, them. There's equally a lot of other ones that are, perhaps to many people less understood, but equally just as valid and important. Z, her, he, yem, hi, him, z, hen. I could go on, and I'm probably would if I did pronounce a lot of them incorrectly. The important thing to call out, though, is they are all important and they mean so much to someone when they are having their identity respected. Equally, it's not a case that you've got to just use one. You can use a mixture of these. That applies for me. I go she, her, they, them. Some people might feel fine using one, other people might need multiple ones. Also, you're not restricted to one for life. Things will evolve, people might change during their life, questioning, understanding, whatever. It's not set in stone, right? So people will change what pronouns they feel respected for. It does change in time. And to the point, you will get some people say, well, actually, that's not grammatically correct. Just for the record, that's absolute rubbish. Using them is grammatically correct. It's been done always throughout history. Whether it's 1386 Canterbury Tales, Shakespeare's Hamlet, Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, I could go on. It's absolutely grammatically correct to use any of these options we're talking about here. I think why are they so important? They help facilitate a safe space because they make people feel respected and included and considered. I think, I would say don't ever underestimate the importance of doing this, because, even people seeing pronouns on badges, name tags, etc., it also promotes discussions. It gets people talking about quite often identities that they may not have even considered. And in doing so, understanding challenges and nuances and the things associated to that identity. And, there's so many different ways that can be done, whether it's, Zoom profiles or social media or name tags or email signatures, or, encouraging people to use their pronouns when they introduce themselves in meetings, recognizing national days of recognition like International Pronouns Day. All of these types of things shine a spotlight on the importance of pronouns. But I think, the main thing is don't underestimate the importance of doing so. And to give some stats to that briefly before I finish, looking at some of the research from the likes of the Trevor Project, one of the world's largest suicide prevention groups for LGBTQI youth, they have categorically found, and this is no surprise, I know, but it's good to confirm in black and white, there is a massive reduction in risk of suicide when people are having their identity and particularly their gender identity also respected. So, doing these things, It might to some seem cliche, but absolutely it's not, because it can make the difference between life and death. So I would say anyone that does these things, takes these steps, you are a superhero. Thank you.
That's fantastic. And I just a fun fact maybe for the audience, Pips, to your point about they, them, and what is quote unquote grammatically correct. Merriam-Webster actually added they, them as a, singular gender neutral pronoun, back in September of 2019, specifically, to your point, to make sure that everyone understood and, is kind of level setting the playing field that, they, them is one of many very common pronoun sets, and sort of to dispel any of those, comments and questions, because it's not for any of us, to question another person's identity. So shifting gears a little bit, Maeve, we met a couple years ago at Goldman working on the pronouns initiative together. Can you talk a little bit about, how you got involved in that work and your story in kind of spearheading those efforts?
Sure. Thank you very much. Sorry, it's a little bit loud in the background. I'm here with some friends, and I'm a little bit intimidated talking about this with you, Julia, because you're the one of the people who spearheaded the project, and kudos to you for doing that. Yeah, so I remember about 2.5 years ago, in April of 2019, there was a panel that you were involved in organizing. Kate was on, and we talked about the importance of pronouns, and that's the first time this really struck home to me. And at Goldman Sachs, up until that time, we didn't have any way for people to self-identify their pronouns, but through this project, people could identify within our internal system what their pronouns were. And that's important to transgender people. And it's also important to allies as well, because when we're just looking for acceptance, right? And when we see allies using their pronouns, this shows us that people have taken the time to learn about us and learn our pronouns and use pronouns, and it's very validating. And there are different aspects to this initiative. One is just there's a technical aspect to actually creating the field to allow people to do it, but more importantly, it's that communal aspect and creating that welcoming community for transgender people. And I'd also say, I referred to that panel which talked about pronouns and other ways to make the workplace more welcoming for transgender people. Up until that point, I was out in my social life, but I was not out at work. And it was just hearing Kate and the other panelist members talk about their experiences that helped me identify and feel comfortable coming out. So I made a decision to come out while I was viewing that panel. So these panels are very, very important because it gives people who might be experiencing these things privately to identify with other people and kind of get more comfortable with the idea of potentially being out. So really commend you for organizing this panel.
I'm getting misty-eyed, Maeve. My makeup is going to run. No, thank you. And I think it's true. Panels like this, conferences like this, they add a lot more value than I think we know on the surface. I think there's a lot of education, but it goes a lot deeper. And I think as humans, we all want to connect with others, and there's a real facilitation of that happens, when we can all be more open about our identities. And so, Kate, our theme for our theme for EUROUT this year is intersectionality. And I think, this panel and something you and I have talked about, while it's a great step, in the right direction, when we think about intersectionality, we think about, the TGNC and non-binary communities, we're not, as a society and even, in our own community, I would criticize always amplifying, uplifting all voices, right? Particularly as it relates to, LGBT folks of color, and particularly, trans folks of color and Black trans women specifically. So can you talk a little bit about, what's the work that we still need to do, we being society. So, allies, members, people in the trans community, gay, cis people, et cetera. Like what is that work that we still need to do to make sure all voices are represented?
Yeah, so I mean, intersectionality is really, really critical in everything we do for the exact reasons that you just listed, Julia, right? Like we are so many communities wrapped up under this umbrella acronym, and becoming more and more inclusive and diverse all the time, right? So if you want to think about some of the communities under the LGBTQ plus umbrella, right? You've got our neurodiverse community. You've got a large disability community. Heck, think about it. You've got our immunocompromised community that has certainly been top of mind over the last couple of years here. You've got Black and Brown communities, right? There are so many different ways to break up, if you will, what this community is and its different intersections. It's a really vibrant, amazing community, right? But it has all of these different layers to it, right? To your points, as a student of history, right? Someone who really, really enjoys this stuff, you look at the way historically benefits accrued across the acronym, right? Where you look and say a lot of the benefits historically have gone to the L and the G, not so much focused on B and T historically. And in particular, right, cisgender white men, I think have really gotten the benefit of a lot of advocacy wins over the last 52 plus years since Stonewall. This is a starting point, but right, when one of us does better, we all do better. Mm-hmm. And so I think the work that is yet to be done really has to be focused on anti-Black racism, particularly here in the United States and in many other countries where we've seen movements across the globe, right? And that is anti-racism efforts within white-collar spaces and within queer spaces, right? I think there are a lot of people who don't necessarily feel safe in their identities within queer spaces. And so, it's thinking about how do we create queer spaces and white-collar spaces that uplift Black and Brown communities, right? And in particular, right, even look at the history of the LGBTQ plus community, right? When you think about things like Stonewall and who really led the charge there, it was trans women of color, right? It was Marsha P. Johnson, it was Sylvia Rivera. And fast forward a couple of years and, they were given no platform. They were heckled off stage at Pride a couple of years afterward, right? And so, it's so critical to honor them and to realize that there is this huge proportion of our community that isn't being given a platform and more than anyone deserves it, right? And so I think to continue doing that, right? One, as Pip said, so much of it is about normalizing these conversations, right? If we can talk about things like gender, particularly again in spaces with communities of color, I think that is incredibly valuable. And if we can give people gateways to living authentically, right? If you can't see it, you can't really dream it. You don't attempt to be it, right? Yeah. And so we have to make these spaces for people to be able to live authentically. And I think, it's incumbent upon this audience in particular, right? B school students, B school community, young professionals, to create the diverse and inclusive workforces that we have always talked about and that we all want, and recognizing that creating that diverse workforce is actually a catalyst for elevating some of these voices that have otherwise been overlooked.
Definitely. And so I guess just last question for, each of you before we move into Q&A. What would be one piece of advice that you would, offer to our audience today? Either ways to become more familiar with pronoun sharing, or, what do folks do if they make a mistake? Like, what are some, tangible tools or tips people can, take away from our discussion? So Pips, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Julia. That's a really good one. And the problem is there's so many, right? So I'll try and keep it succinct. I think, really put into practice some of the steps that I touched on earlier, in terms of the encouraging people to discuss this thing, the email signatures, the name tags, and just denormalizing this conversation so that it becomes much more mainstream and much more understood as to why it makes such a difference, and put this into practice. Always ask if you're not sure, never assume someone's gender identity or their pronouns. And in doing so, honestly, that makes such a difference to them. And you really will be surprised how quickly, when you start doing that, that becomes normal practice. You just get used to being much more considerate. And it doesn't even just apply to identity, it applies to inclusive language and different ethnicities and genders of people's partners. All of these things fall into that inclusive language that has such an important, powerful impact. And if you do make a mistake, apologize, move on. And I think finally, going back to my earlier point, be proud of the difference that you're making. I know when I first come out in the financial services sector, trading floor, very sort of not always something you'd consider a considerate environment. Coming out as the first non-binary, gender fluid, someone that's going to be different is scary as hell. So knowing that you've got allies around you, knowing that people have taken the time to understand pronouns and identities and how they can step up as an ally and the difference that makes, honestly, that makes so much difference. So take stuff if you learned from the way, get insight, get education, put it into practice, speak to your teams, your colleagues, your families, your friends, because in doing so, you'll be propagating so much difference out to the world. So, and obviously, again, that makes a big difference. So I'm proud of everyone that takes those steps. Thank you, Julia.
Thanks, Pips. Maeve, what advice would you offer to everyone?
Sure. If you really think about it, there are so many male-centric terms in our vocabulary every day. So even apart from this conversation, you can start using gender-neutral terms: person, parent, chairperson, spokesperson, police officer. Just start doing that. It's the right thing to do. And then secondly, if you meet a transgender person and you're not really sure what the proper pronouns are, what the proper terms are, please ask. I never get offended when somebody asks me a question out of kindness. So ask, and we'll help you.
Thanks. I'm sure a lot of people are going to take you up on that, actually, Maeve. And Kate, what advice would you offer for the audience?
Sure. So one thing I would say that's kind of big for me is we often use the term preferred pronouns. My pronouns are not preferred. They just are, right? And to put that into a different context, I would say, it was probably 20-ish years ago, but the term sexual preference was very common in the LGBTQ plus community. And now that sounds like nails on a chalkboard, right? It's not a sex that I prefer. Like that just is my sexuality, right? And so I would say just remember, pronouns aren't preferred, they just are. And I would say one other one I would share is allow people to define their own first adjective, right? So before I transitioned, you could have called me smart, gregarious, witty, whatever. But the moment I transitioned, I lost that right. I became the trans person who was all of those things, right? And so I would say make sure that you're always valuing those people and allowing them the ability to define their own first adjective. The last thing I would say is kind of to the points that both of my esteemed colleagues have made thus far, right? Which is sometimes you might get feedback that says, hey, you know what, you kind of dropped the ball there, or you could do better. When I share that feedback, it is never from a place of anger, right? And I think the natural inclination is for people to get very defensive when they say, I'm your friend, I'm your ally, I'm your colleague, I don't mean to offend you. Like, why would you come at me like that? It's not a fun conversation for someone to have, right? And I would just say the only reason I'm having that conversation with you is because I know you to be a friend, an ally, and someone who wants to do better and get this right. So I would say if you receive that type of feedback, be open to it. Don't be defensive, because it's not exciting or fun for the person on the other end. And the only reason they're sharing it with you is because they believe and know that you want to do better and be the best ally that you can be to them.
Yeah, and I would just echo that point before we go into Q&A. You know, if you had a mentor give you advice, you would receive that, you know, usually welcomingly. You know, you'd be grateful for their wisdom and the insights that they shared. But Kate, to your point, you know, we often receive feedback like what you just described defensively. But you know, someone's taking time out of their day to invest in you and invest in you, you know, doing better and showing up, you know, more authentically for this community, you know, better the next time around. So definitely take that feedback, you know, to heart, but also be really open, be really receptive, because it's only coming from a good place and folks wanting you to grow, right? The goal there is sort of you moving in the right direction, and that's really special. So I think we have time for some questions. Are there any questions from the audience or folks on Zoom?
Hello, thank you all for sharing your stories and your advice with us. My question is, in your experience advocating for pronouns and better use of pronouns in multinational organizations, how did you translate that advocacy into other languages, particularly ones that have pronoun structures that are different than English?
Julia, who are
Don't
you?
all jump in at once there.
I can make a brief start. I mean,
Please.
that is such a good question, because I think, as we've seen in terms of language, there are so many different slants of this in different languages, and some languages already include it, other ones absolutely do not, and different ways in between, almost a non-binary language in itself. I think the approach we've took is to try and encourage all of our different regions and all of our different networks to promote this from within their area and use whatever the sort of the preferred, you know, regional / local guidance or options are. And, you know, absolutely there are some countries where that has been far more challenging. So it's been in those cases where the language is perhaps not where it needs to be or doesn't support it naturally. It's more about generating the narrative for people to understand, you know, what we're trying to achieve from this. So it's a really tricky one, but we always try and encourage this across all regions, all locations. And even if the language doesn't always support this, as perhaps it does in other languages better, make sure the focus is still on the topic, you know, not just put it aside because it can't be done in that given language. I know that covers a few other things, but that's definitely the approach we found, because it's more about the rhetoric and the narrative that we're trying to foster from this and what stands behind that.
I think, I mean, Kate and Maeve, curious for your thoughts. I'm happy to talk about the experience we had at Goldman. I think the approach we took was the pronouns initiative that we led focused a lot more on increasing education and awareness than the specific mechanisms through which pronoun sharing became more available. So to Maeve's point, there's certainly a technological aspect. You know, pronouns at Goldman are now available in, you know, your email signatures, your name tags. We created these pride flags that can go on your desk. So there's the sort of pronoun facilitation piece, but it's really a component of the much broader conversation around, you know, what kind of workplace do we want? Do we want a workplace where everyone can show up and thrive and be their authentic self and have that person be the same person that they are outside of work? Or are we facilitating an environment where people have to code switch? They're covering, they can only share certain parts of their identity outside of work, right? And that at work, it's a different place and certain identities aren't welcomed and accepted. So we definitely ran into that at Goldman of certain languages. And we actually had to, we put a note on our website, you know, that not all languages use specifically like she, her, he, him pronoun sets. Culturally, that's not reflected globally, but that the point of the initiative was, what are the pronoun sets and how does the act of pronoun sharing foster a more inclusive environment? And it was the tapping more into that human aspect than anything. that I think made a difference, because people proactively sharing their pronouns led to more folks coming out, more trans people feeling like Goldman was a place where they could work, other people feeling like there are other parts of their life that don't necessarily relate to their, sexual orientation or gender identity, but now they can bring those other pieces of their life into the workplace because we've, broken down the barriers that have so historically existed, particularly a place like Goldman, which has been around for 152 years or something. So it was more the focusing on like, how does pronoun sharing foster more inclusive and respectful workplaces?
And if I can jump in really quickly,
Yeah.
the last thing I would say in the Goldman context, and Julia, you would know this even better than I would, was that particularly in these large multinational organizations, these initiatives tend to be very buttoned up, and they tend to be reviewed by everyone. And everyone includes a legal department. And so when you think about just getting everyone onto the same page to do something as transformative as a pronouns initiative, I think, we were so excited just to get it over the line, right? To get everyone to agree on what this can, should, and ultimately did say was a minor miracle in and of itself, right? And just doing that in one language. I think your point and your question is a fantastic one, right? And it is more than likely a next step or two or three down the road. But it also, I think, has sort of that legal element to it, which is that to the extent large organizations, multinational organizations are doing this, they will also have to be mindful of the local legal landscape in the ways that you can say certain things, the way that you may ultimately end up translating something may not be in line with what you are really attempting to get across at this point. So I think that legal context is also one to keep in mind.
I believe there was another hand up.
Thank you. It was really lovely listening to all of you share your thoughts. When we discuss marginalized communities with the trans and LGBTQIA+ mission was started by the Black trans community. How do we ensure that we are educating the marginalized communities? We are all very privileged to be here today and to be able to listen to ways to go forwards, but how do we ensure that these communities are educated?
Maybe I'll start out.
Go for it.
I think it's important to have more marginalized transgender communities represented on panels like this. It's great that the three of us are here, but we're all white. So, we need to do better going forward on panels. And I think for these marginalized communities, seeing transgender role models speaking publicly on panels, being interviewed, that sends a very powerful message. So we definitely need to do better there.
That's spot on. And I guess one thing I'd add as well is, we always try and focus on intersectionality because that helps cohese these different groups together. We have intersectionality champions on each of the networks just to make sure that those networks and, whether it's the BAME and ethnicity and LGBT and all of those are not working in silos, making sure that there's intersections between them, making sure there's collaborative events, making sure that allies of one group are being informed and educated about being an ally to the other group. Because I guess growing that community across those different silos and trying to sort of foster that intersectionality to have that better representation is really important. So just doing all that we can to break down those barriers, be it through working together, be it through education, insight, lived experiences, courageous conversations, all of those things that go to create sort of the inclusive culture we're trying to foster. And that needs to include everybody. And obviously, I think representation of all those different subsets is definitely something we need to work harder on.
And all I would add is, going back to just the room of people here, right? As a business school student myself, it is incumbent upon me to create the workplace and the culture that I want to see within the world, right? So that is absolutely the elevation of disadvantaged communities, right? And so you begin to give voice to these people who otherwise haven't had a platform and have unbelievable life-altering stories to tell, right? And so if you create that space, if you create an environment for people to thrive and succeed, I really think the rest will work itself out, right? I'm not going to sit here and say that there's like a pipeline problem. There's not enough really, really talented, TGNC folks in community X. Like that is patently absurd, in my opinion, right? There are some amazing people through all intersections of our communities, right? And so for me, it's about how do I empower each and every person that I am in contact with, regardless of where they sit in all of these different intersections, to be the best version of themselves that they can be. And if I can go and do that as a future business leader, right, then I expect that the business leaders who come after me, right, will hopefully embody some of those things that I myself have tried to bring, and that they will be reflective of the society in which I operate.
Yeah, and I would just add to close this out, I think there's just more reaching across the table that has to be done. I think as a community, we don't know our history. We've talked about Stonewall and Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera today. I don't think we talk about them enough. I don't think enough people know that Transgender Day of Remembrance is tomorrow, and that year over year, Black trans women continue to face the most harm, the most violence, continue to be murdered at the most alarming rates. And I don't think we know our history. And I think a lot of it is unpleasant. I think a lot of it is hard to look at. But I don't think we do enough reaching across the table. And so I think, to your point and your question, more of that reaching across the table is incumbent on both sides. And I would encourage everyone today, look for content, media, friends, colleagues that you don't normally source. If there's something on Netflix that you haven't watched that features a cast of people that, identities that you haven't really looked at, look at that. There's a lot of podcasts out there that talk about these issues. You can subscribe to whatever version you want, but look at the content and the people you bring into your life. How diverse is that group? I would close with Disclosure. Is an incredible documentary on Netflix. If you haven't seen it, I would watch it. But things like that, who's in your life and what identities aren't there, and how do you, make that more inclusive? Because that's really the way we're gonna, reach across the table and reach more people. So with that, massive thanks to all of our panelists, and thank you everyone here. I think now y'all get a lunch break.